Okay, here we go with the latest episode of the supernatural 1967 Chevy Impala build. Okay, here we're going to be looking at the finished chassis. In the last video, we saw the start of the chassis work with the front suspension. The chassis is now complete, front and rear, and it's actually a pretty nice setup. This kit is lacking in a few areas, but this is not one of them, as the front suspension, as noted in a previous video, is pretty well represented, and with slight modifications can be made to have actual working steering. Now what I did to accomplish this was, if you look here at the instructions, this is your steering linkage. It had two small arms which came out and would hit the front cross member, which would not allow movement side to side. Now, I don't know if this kit was intended for posable steering. I would think that it was, because the spindles are mounted between the two control arms, as you can see here. The control arms are glued to the frame, and then the spindles just sit freely inside it. Now, the instructions do tell you to glue them here to the upper, to the lower control arm and the upper control arm. It tells you to glue them in, but if you don't glue them in, it allows them to swivel. Now, once you cut the arms here and here, you no longer have the blockage on the subframe, and it allows you the side-to-side movement for steering. Then what I did is I took a piece of sprue rod from Evergreen, and I fabricated these end caps or nuts. Don't know if I'm going to leave them that color. I painted them brass just to give it a slight different metallic hue. I may change that. But these are actually serve as nuts holding the steering assembly onto the spindles. Let's see if we can give you a good look at that there. Because the spindles have small pegs that the steering assembly sits on. As you can see here, this sits on the small pegs here on the spindle. Now, they are not long enough for you to take the easy route out and just melt the tip of it to hold the steering rack in place. So what I actually had to do was shave the ends of the tie rods down to make them just a little bit thinner, which allows the tip of these locating pins to stick up above the tie rods. Did it on both sides. Then with a little bit of super glue, I cut the piece of evergreen rod and glued it to the tip of the little post that the tie rods grab, making sure that none of the super glue gets on the tie rods. And that is what's holding the tie rod assembly to the spindle, which then gives you your side-to-side steering. Now, why they wouldn't have done that in the kit, seeing as how it seems to be perfectly suited to steering, posable steering, I don't know, but this little modification will allow you to pose the wheels. Now, let's take a look at the rear. The rear is a multiple piece setup containing upper and lower control arms, springs, and shocks. Now, what they want you to do is to paint the differential in steel, the axle carriers in black, which from reference photos that I've seen is how they came, so I followed that. Then I just took these springs and I highlighted them with just lost my light. Highlighted them with some steel so that you can see the coils. Then I took the shocks and I painted them yellow as Monroe shocks, which were standard equipment on a lot of GM cars, also available in the aftermarket, are yellow. And then dirtied them up a bit, as Baby is not a new car and she has quite a few miles on her. So I dirtied them up a little bit just to give them a little more of a realistic appearance. And that pretty much completed the rear suspension, which again is a pretty good looking representation of what the rear suspension in this car looks like. It's a little tricky lining up the upper and lower control arms as you're putting the spindle in, as you're putting the rear axle in. What I did was I attached the upper control arm, the lower control arms, which are here, and then I inserted the upper control arms into the rear differential. I think you can see it there. Just as a press fit, because they fit kind of snug in there. Then I took the rear differential and inserted it. Let's see if you can see that a little bit better. Inserted it underneath the control arms. Dabbed with super glue to hold them in, and then swung the upper control arms down into the bracket on the chassis. So now that positioned them, and then I used the shocks with just slow setting glue. You don't want super glue here because you may have to adjust the position of the rear axle. So I took the shocks with slow setting glue, set everything up, and then just moved it to where I thought it's going to sit evenly from side to side. So you definitely don't want to use a lot of super glue here, as you need something that's going to cure slowly so that you can make all your adjustments. Then you install the final part, which is the rear sway bar, the diagonal bar there, and your rear suspension is finished. It's a really better than I expected, and looks really nice altogether. And that completes the entire chassis, which now has, as I said before, posable steering. It's an easy enough modification. Fully detailed rear. And there it is with the engine inserted. Let's see if I can bring it into the light. And here's a little sneak peek at the interior getting started. Just mocking it all up together. Have the carpeting done. And we'll be looking at that more in the next video. Alright, well, that's pretty much it. And that's our whole look at the chassis. Alright, I'll see you in the next one.